the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where he's worked since 1986. For many years, he taught preservation law at the University of Maryland graduate program in preservation, and he has degrees from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as well as Johns Hopkins University. Tom is the author of many different articles that cover a wide range of topics, including preservation easements, shipwreck preservation, historic house museums, which I was talking to him about earlier this morning, the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as preservation public policy. And that just covers a few of the topics that he's written about or co-authored articles about. In 2013, Tom was awarded the National Endowment for the Arts Rome Prize in Historic Preservation from the American Academy in Rome, a really fabulous opportunity. The research that Tom did entitled him to author a recent series of essays, some of you may have seen those, titled Why Old Places Matter, in which he examined some of the many reasons why historic places are good for people, for us. The idea that old places are important to us is obviously a very deeply held belief, but the reasons are not often articulated or expressed adequately. Tom's exploration and his writing provides direction for future efforts by identifying why old places matter, recognizing what we choose to preserve, and then addressing how to preserve them. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Tom to Minnesota, and I want you to please join me in giving a warm Minnesota welcome to Tom Mills.
Thank you, Michael. I very much appreciate everything that you've done, both in inviting me and making this an easy and convenient trip for me. So thank you for everything that you've done, and for all of you who are here participating in the conference, and for all of you who have a hand in pulling this conference together. I am delighted to be able to talk to you all this morning about something that I think that all of you care a great deal about. Why do old places matter? This is a project, as Michael said, that I was able to work on because of both the National Trust for Historic Preservation and also because of the American Academy in Rome. And I think it's particularly important that we ponder why old places matter, why we preserve, as we celebrate both the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service and the 50th anniversary of the enactment of the National Historic Preservation Act. And as a part of that anniversary, how we ponder the future of historic preservation. How will we do our work in the future? This evening, you'll have the opportunity to participate in a national park through the riverboat cruise, and the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area. So I hope you'll all be able to do that and actually see some of the good work that the Park Service does. Now, I will just say, when you have elected officials like this, I'm not sure you need me up here speaking. I was blown away by the mayor's comments, and you'll see as I go through the explanation of why old places matter, that you already have many of these ideas embedded. The things that you spoke about in terms of how these places define who we are, how they embody our memories, how you remember your first confession, your parents' wedding, all of those different things are really one of the reasons that we do the work that we do. So you've already got that captured in your ideas, and clearly it is an ethic here in Hastings. I loved going into the Onion Grill and seeing this sign, which was great. And as I go through this presentation, I hope each one of you will be thinking about the resources in your communities and which parts of these reasons resonate with you, which parts actually make sense to you, why these places matter to you. Here in Hastings, not only the Onion Grill, but also a vibrant downtown with with active businesses, a residential area where people are still living in the houses, the locks that are still being used. These are all old places that continue to matter to people. So please personalize this as I go through the presentation. Now, before I delve into the specific reasons that I think old places matter, I want to give you a little bit of background. How did I come to this project? Where someone posted online recently, seems kind of crazy that we even have to ask why old places matter. Well, it partly begins with writing this chapter in A Richer Heritage on historic preservation law and public policy. As Michael said, I taught at the University of Maryland for about 15 years, and I wrote this chapter, and a theme emerged. And the theme was, until we had a stronger ethic of historic preservation, we were unlikely to have stronger laws and public policies. That we actually needed to build the ethic in order to maintain the strength of our laws and policies. So I started talking to my students about this, and beginning each class with talking about why we have historic preservation law. And what I discovered is that most of the students couldn't really articulate why we have historic preservation law, and then the conversation would very quickly sort of morph into, why do we have historic preservation at all? Why do we do historic preservation? And it seemed to me that being able to express why we do historic preservation will make a big difference in the future. And until we could do that, our policies were always going to be at risk. So I started to look around at existing statements, and I found that the current statements were limited. They were often brief and not very evocative. They often simply repeated the things that are built in as purposes in our existing laws, and they're fairly limited in scope. And that the reasons really had not been re-examined very much since 1965, with the publication of this book, With Heritage So Rich, which is the book that led to the enactment of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966, 50 years ago. So as we celebrate the anniversary of the Act, it's particularly appropriate that we revisit why we're doing this. So I proposed a project to the American Academy in Rome to explore this topic and to try to not develop the ideas on my own, but to find them and articulate them, and to give people the words and phrases that they might be able to use to say why old places matter to them. So I was on sabbatical here for 6 months, about 3 years ago, looking at this very topic. So how did I go about doing it? I didn't only want to hear from preservationists. So I interviewed a wide variety of people. I interviewed historians, curators, architects, restaurateurs, classicists, poets, writers, filmmakers, artists, a whole host of different people, including affordable housing advocates, and people who don't even consider themselves preservationists, to try to hear what they said about why old places matter. And I also explored the history of preservation. I think we think of preservation as being a relatively new impulse, but it isn't. It's a very old one. In the upper left hand, right there, you see Dr. Kim Bowes from the University of Pennsylvania standing on the Palatine Hill in Rome, explaining the history of the preservation during the age of Augustus of the hut of Romulus, which was consciously preserved as a historic site during that era. So this is a very old impulse, not something that's relatively new. So the result of this has been a series of essays published in the National Trust Forum blog on why old places matter, and you can read them online. They're available, and Michael very kindly included in the materials a summary of those from the National Alliance of Preservation Commission's newsletter. The real purpose of these essays is to spur a conversation around the underlying reasons that we do the work we do. and to build this ethic of saving old places. Let me say at the outset that I don't think there is a set number of reasons. I wrote about 14 reasons, but there are many others, and people keep giving me other words that I could have written about. So there's not really a set number of reasons, and different ones apply at different places. Different ones resonate with people differently over time. But what I really hope will happen as a result of these essays and the presentation today is that you will be thinking about why old places matter to you and your community, and ponder what this might mean for how we do our work over the next 50 years as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act. So, there's the intro. So here we go with the words. And some of the things that Mayor Hicks said in particular, I think are really going to resonate as we go through this. So one of the words that I heard most often was continuity. Old places give people a sense of continuity. In a world that is constantly changing, old places give people a sense of being part of a continuum that is necessary for them to be psychologically and emotionally healthy. I'm going to read a quote from the environmental psychologist Maria Lewica. The majority of authors agree that development of emotional bonds with places is a prerequisite of psychological balance and good adjustment, and that it helps to overcome identity crises and gives people the sense of stability they need in an ever-changing world. We see this in our communities. We see this in schools and churches. Exactly the sort of things that Mayor Hicks talked about with this place, that this building provides people with a sense of stability because it anchors their memories and their identity. I use as an example here College Station School, here where my father went, which still remains in our community as a preschool today. And we see this sense of continuity most emphatically when the sense of continuity is broken. This is a place called Palmer Chapel in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Palmer Chapel was originally used by a community of people who were displaced by the creation of that park. And yet, generations later, people continue to come back there for reunions because the place remains so important to them. And on the right-hand side is a place in Italy. The same displacement happens all over the world. People in Matera, Italy, were displaced theoretically for better housing. And yet, the grandmother of one of our tour guides there said, the community has never been the same since we were moved to the new place where we live now. I pondered this displacement last night when in the Main Street Awards, the town of Ferryville was given an award for an event that they do which brings immigrant communities together to celebrate the town and so that people can interact with each other. And one of the phrases that was used was that these were communities that had lost so much by virtue of having to leave where they were from and come to a new place. Yet here was a Main Street program that was trying to help heal that loss from displacement by creating a sense of identity and a sense of community with a new community. So I commend that. I found it deeply meaningful. Old places matter because they give us a sense of continuity. Memory. Just like Mayor Hicks remembered his first confession here, and his parents remembered their wedding here, old places help us remember. The architect Mary Denadai tells her granddaughter, old places are like memories you can touch. Memory is an essential part of our consciousness, and we can see the impact of the loss of memory in people who have Alzheimer's, where it's almost like their identity is erased. And there is, as the geographers Stephen Polsher and Derek Alderman say, an inextricable link between memory and place. People anchor their divergent memories in place. There are two aspects of memory. individual memory, and here I use the Cafe Reggio in New York, where I went in my 20s. It's a place that still remains. When I go back there, I can measure myself against the person I was then. And then there's collective memory, that societal sense of memory that people have. And I use the reflecting pool at the Lincoln Memorial, where we have a collective national memory around the events that took place there, like the March on Washington, even if we may not have been there, a sense of collective memory. And we find this memory in places like battlefields. And there are even those who talk about the way places embed memory that people may not yet retain. I use this cemetery gate from my home church, Rhema Presbyterian Church in North Carolina, where you can see that the gate is there, and yet there are no walls. The church, in a foolish act of frugality, sold the stone walls to the highway department to use for building material, and yet the fact that that gate retains the memory of those walls that were once there. Old places serve as mnemonic aids that anchor our memory. Individual identity. Old places embody our identity. People have long recognized this link, from Cicero, who wrote about returning to his grandfather's house, to James Marston Fitch, who wrote that preservation affords the opportunity for the citizen to regain a sense of identity with their own origins, of which they have often been robbed by the sheer process of urbanization. Psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and architectural theorists all study the relationship between place and identity, and most would agree that place is inextricably linked with the development and maintenance of continuity of self. Our sense of identity, however, is not static. It changes over time. So although I have a sense of identity with Rhema Presbyterian Church and my great-grandfather's house, I also have a sense of identity around the American Academy in Rome and Chapel Hill and other places that I've been. But here's one of the things I found that really surprised me. It doesn't take but one generation for this sense of identity to grow and take root. You may be pondering why a 1970s mall sign is on this slide. This is Eastland Mall in Charlotte, which was the mall of my junior high school years, where as I was writing this essay, it was being proposed to be demolished. And to my astonishment, a preservation group was formed to save it, saying that it embodied the identity of the east side of Charlotte. An entire generation of people had, like me, grown up going to this mall. And the man hired to demolish the mall, who owned the demolition company, actually formed a memory site on his website where people could share their memories of the mall, because he had met his wife ice skating at the mall. His memories were anchored there. But what this led me to conclude, interestingly, was that it only takes about 30 years for a place to become old. And I'll come back and talk about the ramifications for that later. Civic identity. Old places embody our civic identity. This has long been one of the primary reasons that we do historic preservation. And I use Independence Hall, which embodies the whole notion of the history of the United States and the identity of the United States. The preservation world has long championed these types of sites, beginning with the Historic Sites Act of 1935, which tried to protect sites for patriotism and for national identity. But I noted when I talked to people about these sites that we no longer feel very comfortable talking about patriotism as a reason to save old places, a reticence that reflects what Edward Said described as the vexed issue of nationalism and national identity, of how memories of the past are shaped in accordance with a certain notion of what we, or for that matter, they, really are. We've left people out. Slaves were not mentioned at plantation houses that were preserved. Native Americans were treated as the enemy at frontier forts. And countless workers and everyday people were not acknowledged. And national identity can be manipulated as people are left out. Here's a building in Rome called the Square Colosseum that Mussolini had built specifically to try to tie his regime to imperial Rome. But the thing about old places that's interesting to me is that the continued presence of these old places permits and may even foster the acknowledgement of changed identities over time, the transformation of that identity, like the way slavery is now acknowledged at Monticello and Mount Vernon. Old places often become the vortex where these discussions happen, however uncomfortable they may be. Right now, one of the hot topics in parts of the United States are Confederate memorials. And there's one right here, you can see it's covered over. This is actually a Confederate memorial from my hometown, which was graffitied with the Black Lives Matter tag. And the interesting thing to me is that the continued presence of this type of old place actually allows a conversation to take place. It allows the community to come around and have a discussion that acknowledges the painful past and hopefully leads to the reconciliation around that painful past, which is happening in certain parts of the country. There are also places that embody our universal identity. And I use here the example from the Bamayan Buddhas. When those Buddhas were blown up and destroyed, we all felt a palpable sense of loss. They were part of our universal identity. And old places help define us throughout the world. Old places are part of our collective identity. Beauty. Old places are beautiful. If you Google beautiful places, what you get is a lot of natural places and a lot of old places, and only a handful of new places. Beauty and the threat to beautiful places was the driving force for many early preservation efforts, and beauty remains at the heart of why people care. We all know how much harder it is to save an ugly building than it is to save a beautiful building. Yet, as I talked to people about beauty as a reason, I found that people were reticent to talk about it, again, like patriotism. And I think people on preservation commissions and in other public fora are often hesitant to make decisions based on beauty, despite the fact that preservation is referred to as aesthetic regulation. We don't often expressly ground our decisions in the idea of beauty. It's for many reasons. The subjective nature of beauty, the difficulty of defining it, the loaded cultural aspects of beauty, or the fact that, as you've probably heard, it's often considered frivolous or expendable. Yet, beauty is something that delights, moves, and satisfies people. A study by the British Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment found that beauty is a deeply positive experience, contributing to happiness and well-being. There are even those that say the experience of beauty changes our brain chemistry. Yet here's the really interesting thing. Preservation is the public forum where concepts of beauty change. Preservation has been a march of the ugly transforming into the beautiful. I remember when Victorian houses were considered ugly. Then Art Deco was considered ugly. Moderne was considered ugly. Mid-century modern, in some cases, might still be considered ugly. Brutalism, which I show here, is the current context where we're talking about ideas of beauty. And it is often in the context of a preservation discussion that we bring forward the notion that these buildings that might be 30 or 40 or 50 years old are actually more beautiful than people currently recognize. Old buildings matter because they are, or they may become, beautiful. History. Old places give us an understanding of history that no other documents possibly can. How? Old places have the unique ability to have people experience history with all of their senses. It tells us different information. It allows us to experience history with full body immersion. I show President Lincoln's cottage here, where President Lincoln lived during the Civil War, during the summers. People love going there because they can experience the actual spaces where the Lincolns lived. They can touch the handrail that he touched as he walked up to bed. It connects them to him directly. And here is Emily Dickinson's house, where people can learn something about her poetry that they cannot learn from reading the poetry alone. And then there are battlefields where I've had people say they could not actually understand the history of a battle until they went to the battlefield and saw the exact rise in the land that allowed them to understand why certain battalions lived and certain battalions died. And finally, I put in Fort Padota Snelling here in Minnesota, a fort with a complex and layered history where we have the opportunity to learn history that otherwise we might not remember. The most vivid experience of history is likely to be at a historic place. Old places matter because they are our history. Related to the idea of history is learning, but it's a broader idea. Old places are places where people learn. It's a traditional function of old places, of historic sites throughout the history of preservation, as shown here by Old Salem in North Carolina, where I went as a child, and where I have a vivid memory of eating Moravian sugar cake and hearing a woman sing Moravian songs. And like many other students, some of the only history I remember from my school years is the history from the field trips, like this field trip to Old Salem, and I think you'll find that's a common experience. But there are broader things we learn at old places. And I show here a place called the Kwantai Temple in Mendocino, California. A Taoist temple built in 1854 in California by the Chinese immigrants. And here is a woman who is a descendant of the people who built that temple. And what she said when we were there was, what people learn when they come to this place, because this place survives, is that we were here. It allows people to know about the Chinese-American immigrant experience. Old places matter because they're unparalleled places to learn. Architecture. Old places as architecture are part of our cultural inheritance. We love old buildings that are architecturally significant because they're part of the cultural legacy of all humankind, and because we love the way they make us feel. I remember the feeling I had in an old house that one of my father's friends, Jim Withers, used as a barn. And we would unload hay in this house, and I knew just from being in the house that there was something different about it. What I didn't realize, that what I was experiencing in that old house was the impact of proportion and harmony and those architectural tools that allow us to feel differently in a space. It was architecture with a big A, even though it was being used as a barn. In the Renaissance, people believed that that was what architecture was about. It made us feel differently. And here I show the Villa Rotonda in Italy, which is the classic example of proportion and harmony. And I also showed Farnsworth House because these ideas of architecture change. And Farnsworth House is where Mies van der Rohe developed the ideas about the relationship of architecture to the natural environment. These places are used as models by architects. And because architects design all the places where we live, work, and play, that would be reason enough to save them. But there are other reasons as well, in addition to this cultural legacy. And as the Finnish architect Juhani Palaasma points out in the recent Forum Journal article, architecture is also important because it places us in the continuum of time. When we see the pyramids, we're immediately placed on the continuum of time of Western civilization. And this is true of the old places in our own communities as well. They immediately place people on the continuum of time. When you see the Leduc Mansion you understand where it and where you as a citizen of this community are placed in time. Sacredness. Some old places matter because they're sacred or because they may be considered sacred. People all over the world find places like the Sanctuario de Chimayo, shown here in New Mexico, to be places that move them. They actively seek to have the experiences that I had at that remarkable place, from the Wailing Wall at Jerusalem to the Kaaba at Mecca, St. Peter's Basilica, Santiago de Compostela, to the shrine at Ise, or Mount Taylor, a natural place in New Mexico. Sacred places have been revered for thousands of years by many different cultures. And there are other ways, in addition to the religious, that places are considered sacred. Sites of conscience are often considered sacred. They have been sanctified by the things that happen there. Places such as battlefields, cemeteries, or a place that the National Trust is working to save in Richmond, Shockoe Bottom, one of the largest slave trading centers in the South. Old places matter because they are revered as being sacred. Creativity. Old places spur creativity. I originally wrote this essay sort of as a throwaway because it was a topic that I was personally interested in, but it's been one that has resonated most strongly with people because it hasn't been explored very much. People are inspired by old places to compose, write, and do other creative work. Why do you think this is an arts center? It's an old place that inspires people. The lower photo is RCA Studio A in Nashville, Tennessee, where Dolly Parton recorded Jolene, where Elvis Presley recorded, and it was saved recently through the efforts of the musician Ben Folds because he wanted it to continue as a place for musicianship, but also because it carried within it the legacy of all those people who had performed before. And here is the studio of Daniel Chester French, a site that the Trust owns in Massachusetts. That's the inside and that's the outside. I chaired a panel there on creativity on old places with a contemporary composer who's shown there in the red pants, and a contemporary sculptor, Judith Shea, who had done a residency there. French was the sculptor of the seated Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial. And the studio and the grounds there continue to inspire contemporary artists today. They have a contemporary sculpture show. Eric Nathan, the composer shown there, has been inspired by old places to write contemporary music. And this is a place in Rome called Santa Sabina. He was inspired by that place to write a new work of music that was recently performed by the Boston Symphony Orchestra players. And he titled it, I am very happy to say, Why Old Places Matter. So you can actually hear a musical performance of this that interprets his ideas of why old places matter to people. Why is it that old places spur creativity? I'm not entirely sure. But there is only one scientific study I'm aware of that seeks to isolate the difference that age makes in places. And it compares a part of Charleston, South Carolina with a comparable community outside of Charleston, South Carolina called Ion that was built to have some of the same architectural characteristics. And what that study found was that people in the old place in Charleston had their imagination spurred more than people in the new place. Something about the old place caused them to spontaneously go through scenarios in their minds about the past. It spurred their imagination more. And the urbanist Richard Florida doesn't say why, but he talks about how creative people in the creative class are drawn to old places. So that this has become a key part of the economic drivers of our country. And what Florida says is that one of the key ingredients of old places is authenticity. As in real buildings, real people, real history is key to attracting the creative class. The National Trust Preservation Green Lab has now demonstrated the power of older and smaller buildings in spurring startups and other economic and social activity. As the American economy increasingly turns to creative work, this may be an ever more important reason to keep and reuse old places. Old places spur creativity. Ancestry. I was so delighted to hear your elected officials talk about their deep rootedness in the community and the way these old places reminded them of their ancestors. Old places do connect us to our ancestors. Making a connection to ancestors used to be something that preservationists actively talked about, but we kind of quit talking about it. And part of that was because it was tagged with being a little bit elitist sometimes or exclusive. And yet there's been an explosion in genealogical research and interest, as witnessed by the fact that Ancestry.com now has 2 million members who pay $19.99 a month to be members or more. That's the starting price. And you get the whole sense of why it's important to people and the idea of, what's one of the first questions you ask people when you meet them? Where are you from? Because it tells you more than anything else about somebody. Here in the upper right is Somerset Plantation in North Carolina, which was one of the earliest plantations that had a slave descendants reunion, where people came back. And it created a connection between that site and the descendants of people who once lived and worked there. Being able to connect with the places where people's ancestors lived and worked gives people a deep sense of satisfaction, a sense of identity, exactly as Mayor Hicks said, and belonging. And they matter because they give us that sense of belonging. Sustainability. The architect Carl Elefante said the greenest building is the one that's already built. The reuse of existing buildings results in a large number of sustainability benefits. I'm going to quickly go through them. Land conservation, because the reuse of the building means you're not using other open land. Habitat conservation, because the reuse of the building doesn't take away natural habitat. Reduced fuel consumption, because existing buildings are usually in walkable and dense areas. Avoidance of adverse impacts from the extraction and transportation of new materials, because the buildings don't have to be taken from mines and transported across the world to be used in the new building, and the avoidance of new landfill material, because the building isn't ending up in a landfill and the existing materials are being reused. I don't think the true green characteristics of existing buildings have been fully recognized. But I will say that if they are, if we begin to recognize more broadly how important reuse is to being green, that has the capacity to change the paradigm for historic preservation. Old places matter because using and reusing them is environmentally sustainable. Community. Old places foster community. But exactly how does this happen? It happens through some of the things that we talked about earlier. First, it gives people a sense of identity, of community identity. It also creates the places where people meet and come together. And one of the best examples of this is post offices. I show a post office down here. Post offices are often part of the identity of the community, just the building itself. And yet there are also places where people meet and come together. For more than 2 decades, planners and academics have talked about the way sprawl has eviscerated our communities. And they talk about placemaking, how to create new places that are walkable, that give a sense of identity and give a sense of community. But there's something that's critically missing in their idea about community, and that is time. In order for any place to form community, there has to be the element of time. And that's what old places distinctly have. Old places are where people and place and time come together to form a sense of community. Old places foster community. Economics. I saved economics for last in my series of essays because it was the one topic that preservationists talked about most often and had explored most through research and through studies. Old places matter because they support a sound, sustainable, and vibrant economy. While I don't think we should reduce the many powerful qualities of old places to simply an economic calculation, the good news is that dozens of studies have proven that historic preservation, that saving and reusing old places is good for the economy. And the economic reasons are closely related to many of the other reasons. Old buildings attract tourists, attract talent and investment, as we saw in the discussion about creativity, serve as incubators for small businesses, as documented in the Preservation Green Lab reports, create jobs and good wages because rehabilitation creates better jobs and better wages, keeps the money in the community because it's more likely to stay in the community during a rehab job, and they revitalize neighborhoods and communities. It's often the primary asset that a community has, and you'll see that particularly in the National Main Street program. Some economists are now trying to capture more values in their work, particularly health factors such as walkability or even the idea of happiness. But just imagine if these economic studies could capture the full value that old places give people, the sense of identity and belonging, the awe of beauty, the creativity and imagination. Then their value would be incalculable. Old places matter because they support a sound economy. Through these essays and through this work, I've become even more convinced that old places matter, even more deeply than I thought they did. I was a dedicated preservationist when I went into this, but I came out of the project thinking, wow, actually old places matter far more than I thought they did. They're necessary for our psychological and emotional health. They ground us with a sense of belonging, they inspire us in creativity, they soothe us with beauty and sacredness. They help us know who we are, just as Mayor Hicks said. I want to share a few quick conclusions with you that I noted along the way. First, as I just said, old places are even more fundamentally important than I thought. Our work is often perceived of as being something nice, as being the dessert, not the dinner. But through this work, I've become more and more convinced that it's fundamentally important, that it really grounds people and helps them become emotionally and psychologically healthy. Our work is dinner, it's not dessert. Second, the world of preservation is much larger than I think it is. We're a good, sizable group in this room, and yet there are many other people in related fields throughout the world, and we should be listening to those people, whether they're architects or architectural historians, but also environmental psychologists and health experts. There's not a lot of intersection between those worlds, and I think there should be more of them. Third, the primary reasons that we usually talk about, architecture and history, while very important, and I would never suggest that we stop doing architecture and history, really only capture the more fundamental reasons as a secondary effect. So one of the questions I have is, how can we manage our tools and shape our tools so that we more completely capture the sense of memory and identity and continuity that people have with old places, and go beyond only architecture and history to try to capture a broader sense of things. And fourth, as I said earlier, old places can be old in only one generation. What do we do about places like the malls of our youth? How do we try to think about reusing those buildings so that we capture those memories and that identity also? And lastly, the issue of sustainability, which I think has the greatest capacity to change our work. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act, I wanted to come back to some of the evocative language of the Act. And I'll just note a couple things. This was passed 50 years ago, yet listen to some of these phrases. The spirit and direction of the nation are founded upon and reflected in its historic heritage. The historical and cultural foundations of the nation should be preserved as a living part of community life and development in order to give a sense of orientation to the American people. And we look at the purposes that they include in the law, the vital legacy of cultural, educational, aesthetic, inspirational, economic, and energy benefits. These are the inspirational ideas that were embedded in the National Historic Preservation Act 50 years ago. I don't think that we have yet fully achieved the import of the National Historic Preservation Act. We've made tremendous progress in 50 years, and preservation is widely accepted throughout the country. Yet, I think as we note the 50th anniversary, we should be thinking how we can more completely fulfill that idea of giving Americans a sense of orientation through old places and reusing them more actively. For the past year, I've been going around the country having conversations, literally with hundreds of people, about the future of preservation. And we've heard this over and over again. I'll just note 3 ideas that have come out of this. First, preservation is about people. People and place, not place alone. And preservation should be more inclusive and democratic. Next, preservation plays a key role in fulfilling fundamental human needs and making people's lives better. But it is only one of many factors in people's quality of life, and we should be aware of how our tools support or don't support some of those other factors, and consider how we can reshape our tools to better fulfill other factors that improve quality of life also. Lastly, perception. Preservation is often perceived in a much more narrow way by the general public than even we think about it. And it is incredibly important that we try to help change that perception of preservation so that people really understand how fundamentally important it is to our lives. It should be perceived as being much more powerful and pervasive, and yet also a practical force to help improve people's lives. I think if we try to strive toward those ideas, we're more likely to help use our old places to fulfill that purpose in the National Historic Preservation Act of providing a sense of orientation for people in their lives. Now, I come back to this American Brewery building in Baltimore. It's a Tax Act project that the National Trust subsidiary did. And when I used this in a presentation at the American Academy in Rome, I was a little surprised when one of the fellows at the Academy came up to me afterwards and said, I want to tell you something. When I found out that I had the disease that I have, and she has a debilitating disease, I lived on the other side of that building from the Johns Hopkins campus. So as it was being rehabbed, I would consciously walk by that building because its rehab and that depressed part of Baltimore gave me a sense of hope about myself that I needed as I was struggling with this disease. I was then really surprised when the riots broke out in Baltimore to see this image show up in the New York Times. And the American Brewery building survived a fire in a building that was being built nearby. The Reverend Dante L. Hickman from the New Shiloh Baptist Church was interviewed in the article, talking about plans to rebuild. He spoke about creating a workforce development program, health services, life coaching, mortgage lending. And he pointed to a broad field across the street that the church had acquired to build a youth center and an abandoned laundry building that he hoped to convert to more housing. We have a mantra, he said, we restore people as we restore buildings. I think this is why old places, old buildings matter, because they have the power to fulfill deep and fundamental human needs. That is both the challenge and the promise of the National Historic Preservation Act at 50. Thank you.